In the scorching heat of the Arizona Territory, where the sun carved deep lines into weathered faces and survival meant more than just drawing your next breath, a story unfolded that would challenge everything one man believed about family, loyalty, and the price of belonging. The year was 1882, and the frontier was a place where bloodlines meant less than the bonds forged through shared hardship and mutual respect. Jacob Morrison had come west with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn determination to carve out a life from the unforgiving desert. His small ranch sat on a patch of land that seemed forgotten by God himself, where the nearest neighbor was a day's ride away, and the silence could drive a man to madness if he let it. For 3 years, he had fought drought, bandits, and his own demons, never knowing that his greatest challenge would come not from the harsh elements, but from an unexpected encounter that would redefine his understanding of what it meant to truly belong somewhere. The Apache women appeared at his door like shadows given form, their presence both mysterious and purposeful, carrying with them secrets that would forever alter the course of his solitary existence. What happened next would transform a lonely rancher into something he never imagined possible, binding him to a heritage that ran deeper than the roots of the ancient mesquite trees that dotted his land. The ritual they spoke of was older than the territory itself, a sacred tradition that transcended the boundaries between cultures and created connections that no law or prejudice could sever. As the eldest woman began to speak in her native tongue, her words flowing like a sacred incantation, Jacob felt something stirring within him that he had never experienced before, a sense of belonging that went beyond mere acceptance and touched the very core of his being. The Apache had been watching him, studying his character through seasons of hardship and solitude. They had observed how he treated the land with respect, how he shared his meager supplies with traveling natives during harsh winters, and how he never raised his hand in anger against those who crossed his path, seeking nothing more than safe passage. These acts of quiet dignity had not gone unnoticed by the tribal elders, who recognized in this solitary white man qualities that many of their own people struggled to embody. His integration into their spiritual family was not a decision made lightly, but one that had been deliberated over countless nights around sacred fires, where the voices of ancestors whispered their approval through the desert wind. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Jacob had ever witnessed or imagined. The women moved with practiced grace, their hands weaving patterns in the air that seemed to tell stories older than memory itself. Each gesture carried meaning that transcended language, speaking directly to something primal and universal that existed within the human spirit. As they began to remove the sacred blanket that covered the ritual objects, Jacob felt his breath catch in his throat, understanding instinctively that he was about to witness something that few outsiders had ever been privileged to see. The responsibility of this moment weighed heavily upon him, yet he also felt a strange sense of peace, as if every difficult choice he had made in his life had led him to this exact instant in time. The eldest woman, her face marked by decades of wisdom and hardship, approached him with eyes that seemed to peer directly into his soul. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of generations, each word carefully chosen and imbued with significance that extended far beyond their surface meaning. She spoke of lineage not as something determined by blood alone, but as a spiritual connection that could be forged through actions, character, and a willingness to embrace responsibility for something greater than oneself. The concept challenged everything Jacob had been taught about family and belonging, opening his mind to possibilities that the rigid structures of his former life had never allowed him to consider. As the ritual progressed, other members of the tribe began to emerge from the desert shadows, their presence adding weight and solemnity to the proceedings. Each face told its own story of struggle and survival, of traditions maintained against overwhelming odds, and of a people who had learned to recognize true character, regardless of the color of skin or the accent of speech. They formed a circle around Jacob and the women conducting the ceremony, their silent support creating an atmosphere of profound spirituality that seemed to connect the earth below to the vast sky above. The desert itself appeared to hold its breath, as if nature itself recognized the significance of what was taking place. The blanket that covered the sacred objects was woven from materials that had been gathered across generations, each thread representing a story, a prayer, or a blessing passed down through countless ceremonies. When it was finally lifted, revealing items that glowed with an inner light and the flickering flames of the ritual fire, Jacob understood that he was looking at artifacts that connected him to a history that stretched back to the very dawn of human consciousness. These were not mere objects, but vessels of spiritual power that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the migration of peoples across vast continents, and the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth that governed all existence. The transformation that began in Jacob that night was both subtle and profound, affecting not just his understanding of himself but his entire relationship with the world around him. As the ceremony reached its climax, he felt layers of his old identity falling away like shed skin, replaced by something that was simultaneously foreign and familiar, new and ancient. The Apache way of seeing the world began to integrate with his own perspectives, creating a synthesis that was neither purely native nor purely settler, but something entirely unique and powerful. This new way of being would guide his actions and decisions for the rest of his life, influencing everything from how he treated the land to how he interacted with the diverse peoples who crossed his path. The days following the ceremony brought practical changes that reflected his new spiritual status within the tribe. Apache families began to visit his ranch, not as strangers seeking temporary shelter, but as extended family members maintaining the bonds of kinship. They shared knowledge that transformed his struggling homestead into a thriving operation, teaching him techniques for finding water in seemingly barren ground, methods for preserving food that could sustain him through the harshest winters, and ways of reading the signs in nature that allowed him to anticipate everything from weather changes to the movement of game animals. This exchange of knowledge was mutual, as Jacob's experience with white society and its ways proved valuable to the tribe in their ongoing efforts to navigate the complex political landscape of the territorial period. The relationship between Jacob and his new Apache family was tested repeatedly, as tensions between native peoples and white settlers continued to escalate throughout the territory. Government officials and military commanders, who had once viewed him as just another struggling rancher, now saw him as a potential threat, someone whose loyalties had been compromised by his association with the tribe. Fellow settlers regarded him with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility, unable to understand how a white man could find common cause with people they had been taught to view as savage enemies. These pressures could have easily driven him back to his former isolation, but the strength of the bonds forged during that desert ceremony proved stronger than the forces seeking to tear them apart. As months turned to years, Jacob's reputation as a bridge between two worlds grew throughout the territory. Disputes that might have erupted into violence were often brought to him for mediation, as both sides recognized his unique ability to understand and communicate the perspectives of each group. His ranch became a neutral ground, where Apache and white settlers could meet without fear, engaging in trade and dialogue that benefited everyone involved. This role required tremendous courage and diplomatic skill, as he constantly walked a tightrope between conflicting interests and deeply ingrained prejudices that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build. The wisdom he gained from his Apache family extended far beyond practical survival skills or conflict resolution techniques. He learned to see time not as a linear progression of moments to be conquered and consumed, but as a flowing river in which past, present, and future existed simultaneously. This perspective allowed him to make decisions based not just on immediate needs or desires, but on their potential impact on generations yet unborn. Every action was considered in terms of its effects on the seventh generation to come, a concept that revolutionized his approach to everything from land management to personal relationships. The spiritual practices he adopted became a source of strength and guidance that sustained him through the most challenging periods of frontier life. Morning prayers offered to the four directions connected him to the natural world in ways that his former religious training had never achieved. Evening ceremonies around the fire provided opportunities for reflection and communion with ancestors, whose presence he could now sense in the flickering flames and shifting shadows. These rituals were not mere superstition or primitive custom, but sophisticated spiritual technologies that had been refined over thousands of years to help human beings maintain their connection to the sacred dimension of existence. His understanding of wealth and success underwent a radical transformation as he internalized Apache values that prioritized community welfare over individual accumulation. The measure of a man's worth was no longer determined by how much he could acquire for himself, but by how much he could contribute to the well-being of the group. This shift in perspective led him to make decisions that seemed economically irrational to his white neighbors, but that strengthened the bonds between him and his adopted family. Resources that could have been hoarded were freely shared, and opportunities for personal gain were often sacrificed in favor of actions that benefited the larger community. The ranch itself began to reflect this new philosophy, evolving from a place of solitary struggle into a hub of community activity and mutual support. Traditional Apache structures appeared alongside the original farmhouse, creating a unique architectural synthesis that embodied the cultural fusion taking place within Jacob's life. Gardens produced not only the crops he needed for survival, but also the sacred plants used in tribal ceremonies and healing practices. The land was managed according to principles that emphasized sustainability and respect for natural cycles, ensuring that it would remain productive for generations to come rather than being depleted for short-term gain. Children from the tribe spent increasing amounts of time at the ranch, learning skills that would help them navigate the changing world while maintaining their connection to traditional ways of life. Jacob discovered a natural gift for teaching, sharing his knowledge of reading, writing, and arithmetic while simultaneously learning from his young students about tracking, plant medicine, and the complex oral traditions that preserved Apache. history, and wisdom. These educational exchanges created bonds that transcended generational and cultural boundaries, establishing relationships that would endure long after the children had grown to adulthood and taken their places as leaders. Within the community, the seasonal rhythms of Apache life became increasingly important to Jacob's daily routine and long-term planning. Spring ceremonies celebrated renewal and new beginnings, marking the time for planting and the initiation of young people into adult responsibilities. Summer gatherings brought together far-flung members of the extended tribal family, creating opportunities for trade, storytelling, and the arrangement of marriages that would strengthen connections between different groups. Autumn rituals honored the harvest and prepared the community for the challenges of winter, while winter ceremonies focused on introspection, the sharing of wisdom, and the maintenance of spiritual connections during the season of greatest hardship. His role as a cultural mediator expanded beyond simple conflict resolution to include the complex task of helping both Apache and white communities understand and adapt to the rapidly changing conditions of territorial life. Government policies that seemed reasonable to bureaucrats in distant Washington often proved disastrous when implemented without understanding of local conditions and cultural sensitivities. Jacob's unique position allowed him to identify potential problems before they escalated into violence, proposing alternative approaches that addressed legitimate concerns while respecting the rights and dignity of all parties involved. The challenges he faced were not limited to external pressures and conflicts. The internal process of integrating to very different worldviews created moments of profound confusion and doubt that tested his commitment to the path he had chosen. There were times when the demands of his Apache family seemed to conflict with obligations to white neighbors and authorities, forcing him to make difficult choices that satisfied neither group completely. These moral dilemmas required him to develop a sophisticated, ethical framework that transcended the simple rules and regulations he had grown up with, embracing instead a more nuanced understanding of right and wrong that took into account the complex web of relationships and responsibilities in which he was embedded. The desert itself became his greatest teacher during these periods of uncertainty and growth. Long rides across the vast landscape provided opportunities for contemplation and communion with the natural world that helped clarify his thinking and renew his sense of purpose. The harsh beauty of the Southwest, with its extremes of temperature and terrain, mirrored the intensity of his own internal transformation, reminding him that growth often required enduring temporary discomfort in service of long-term development. Mountains, mesas, and endless expanses of scrubland became sacred texts from which he learned lessons about endurance, adaptation, and the importance of finding one's proper place within the larger ecosystem of existence. The winter of 1887 brought news that would test everything Jacob had learned about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family. Government forces were mobilizing for what would later be known as the final Apache campaigns, and his adopted family faced a terrible choice between surrender to reservation life or continued resistance that would likely end in death or exile. The decision weighed heavily on the tribal council, where voices of wisdom spoke for peace, while younger warriors argued that death in battle was preferable to slow destruction on government land. Jacob found himself in the impossible position of having information from both sides, knowing that his unique status as a bridge between worlds might be the key to preventing a tragedy that would destroy everything he had come to hold dear. As he sat around the council fire, listening to the debate, Jacob understood that his moment of ultimate testing had arrived. The ceremony 5 years earlier had made him part of the lineage, but now he would have to prove whether that connection was strong enough to survive the ultimate sacrifice. The eldest woman who had first welcomed him into the tribe spoke with tears in her ancient eyes, reminding everyone present that the spirits of their ancestors demanded they choose the path that would ensure the survival of their people, even if it meant abandoning the traditional ways of life that had sustained them for countless generations. Her words carried the weight of prophecy, and Jacob felt the full responsibility of his adopted heritage settling upon his shoulders like a sacred blanket. The solution that emerged from those long nights of deliberation reflected the synthesis of wisdom that Jacob had been developing throughout his years with the tribe. Rather than choosing between resistance and surrender, they would create a third option that honored both the need for survival and the imperative to preserve their cultural heritage. Jacob would use his ranch as a gathering point for tribal members who officially surrendered to reservation authorities while secretly maintaining their traditional practices and preparing for a time when they might reclaim their ancestral lands. This plan required tremendous courage and careful coordination, as discovery by government agents would result in severe punishment for everyone involved. The months that followed tested every skill Jacob had learned and every relationship he had built during his years as a cultural mediator. By day, his ranch appeared to be a simple farming operation worked by Apache laborers who had accepted their fate and embraced the white man's way of life. By night, it transformed into a center of resistance, where traditional ceremonies continued in hidden chambers, where children learned the old stories and songs, and where plans were carefully laid for the preservation of Apache culture regardless of what political changes the future might bring. The deception required constant vigilance and perfect coordination between dozens of people who had to trust each other completely while maintaining elaborate pretenses whenever outsiders were present. Jacob's own transformation reached its completion during this period of ultimate trial. The nervous rancher who had once struggled simply to survive in the harsh desert had evolved into a leader, capable of coordinating complex operations that involved multiple communities and required split-second decision-making under intense pressure. His understanding of both Apache and white psychology allowed him to anticipate problems before they developed, and to craft solutions that satisfied the legitimate needs of all parties while protecting the most vulnerable members of his extended family. The skills he had learned in childhood about reading people and situations proved invaluable as he navigated the treacherous waters of territorial politics and military bureaucracy. The network that grew around Jacob's ranch became a model for indigenous resistance throughout the Southwest, demonstrating that survival did not require complete capitulation to dominant cultural forces. Other tribes sent representatives to learn how Apache traditions could be maintained under the guise of assimilation, and these exchanges created connections that would prove crucial. During later periods of renewed persecution and cultural suppression, the ranch became a node in a vast underground network that preserved native languages, ceremonies, and knowledge systems that might otherwise have been lost forever during the dark years of forced extinction. The children who had grown up spending time at the ranch emerged as leaders of their generation, equipped with the skills needed to function in white society while maintaining deep connections to their Apache heritage. They became teachers, interpreters, and advocates who could speak for their people in governmental proceedings and legal battles, using the white man's own tools and institutions to protect native rights and interests. These young people represented the living embodiment of Jacob's vision of cultural synthesis, proving that it was possible to embrace change without abandoning identity, to adapt to new circumstances without sacrificing the essential values that defined who they were as a people. As the frontier period drew to a close and the Arizona Territory prepared for statehood, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought him from solitary struggling rancher to patriarch of an extended family that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. The phrase that had been whispered to him during that transformative ceremony years earlier had proven prophetic in ways he could never have imagined. He had indeed become part of a lineage, but not merely through adoption into an existing family structure. Instead, he had helped create something entirely new, a synthesis of traditions and perspectives that offered hope for a future where different peoples could coexist while maintaining their distinct identities and contributions to the larger human community. The legacy of what happened on that remote ranch would extend far beyond the lives of those directly involved in its creation. The model of intercultural cooperation and mutual respect that Jacob and his Apache family had developed became a template for similar efforts throughout the American West, influencing everything from educational policies to land management practices. Anthropologists and historians would later study their methods of preserving traditional knowledge while adapting to changing circumstances, recognizing in their example a sophisticated approach to cultural survival that challenged prevailing assumptions about assimilation and resistance. The ranch itself became a place of pilgrimage for later generations of Apache, people seeking to reconnect with traditions that had been maintained through the darkest periods of their history. The ceremonies that had been performed in secret during the years of greatest persecution were eventually restored to their proper prominence, and the sacred sites that Jacob had helped protect became focal points for cultural renewal and spiritual regeneration. His grave, marked with symbols from both Christian and Apache traditions, became a reminder that true belonging transcends the circumstances of birth and encompasses all those who choose to dedicate their lives to the welfare of the community. They have been privileged to join. The story of Jacob Morrison serves as a testament to the transformative power of genuine cross-cultural engagement and the possibility of creating new forms of family and belonging that honor the best traditions of all participants while creating something unprecedented and valuable in a time when fear and misunderstanding often dominated relationships between different peoples. His example demonstrated that authentic connection was possible for those willing to approach others with open hearts and minds, ready to learn and to be changed by the encounter. The whispered words that began his journey into Apache lineage had proven to be both invitation and prophecy, opening a door to possibilities that neither he nor his adopted family could have imagined when they first met on that dusty evening, so many years before. As the desert wind continues to blow across the land that once witnessed this remarkable transformation, it carries with it the echoes of ancient ceremonies and the promise that such connections between peoples remain possible for those courageous enough to seek them. The lineage that Jacob joined continues to this day, not merely as a bloodline or tribal membership, but as a living tradition of respect, reciprocity, and the recognition that our deepest human bonds are forged not by similarity but by the willingness to embrace difference as a source of strength and wisdom.